Hello, this is the start of a new series. It's going to be a series of 6 lectures on the CTMU. I haven't decided what to call it, but I'm starting with the biggest and grandest topic I could think of, the creation of the universe. And, there are obviously a number of different conceptions of this. There's the kind of classical view that the world was created out of nothing in a less than 10,000 years ago. There's the modern scientific view that there was a Big Bang, there was an inception of existence, and since then the universe has cooled and expanded to get to the point it is today with no real teleology or purpose. So, to the best of its ability, the CTMU tries to synthesize these perspectives. Let's say the scientific perspective and religious perspective on creation. But first we need to get into some of the basic principles. So the extended superposition principle, this essentially says, so superposition says, two quantum objects can affect each other at the same time. And this is actually confirmed by recent experiments they did trying to determine whether relativity or quantum mechanics is a more fundamental model of the universe. And they actually confirmed something which Einstein called spooky action at a distance. Essentially, that you can have entangled particles all at very different places in space and time that are meta-simultaneous, as Chris Langan says. But this actually does not, as the experimenters would say, come into conflict with the principle of relativity. Essentially, what's going on here is an extended superposition, which not only relates, entangled quantum objects, but it relates all of reality. So if you think, reality is not just spatial, but it's also temporal. So as we discussed in our last video, Einstein describes the universe as a four-dimensional manifold with x, y, z, and t coordinates. And so essentially what the extended superposition principle is is through the principle of homology, which we'll get to, it enables feedback between any points in that manifold, so any point in time and any point in space can be related to one another as the meta-simultaneity of the same process which is happening. And essentially because they have the same global structure, they're the manifestation of the same will, or the same sets of will at the global and agentive level, or the level of God and the level of humans. They're able to not only relate to one another, so obviously everything in reality has a universal distributed form, it's able to relate to itself and to other things, but it also relates to the whole, so thereby you can have kind of a purpose and design manifest itself through meaningful cross-temporal and cross-spatial feedback. So this is why the universe is able to have self-organization, self-emergence. This is something that isn't really explained in the Big Bang cosmology, is this idea of fine-tuning, this idea of teleology, that it seems fairly evident that there's tons of emergent complexity, organization, etc. in the universe, and if it's just expanding and cooling, even if I don't give you the fundamental ontology, I don't believe that science can explain that. But even if I gave you that, even if I gave you the Big Bang and all this pre-existing matter, why does it form into life and consciousness and stars and galaxy systems? And if you actually look at the constants of physics, this is not what happens the vast majority of times. If you adjust Planck's constant and the size of atoms, you can look at this, you can play with this. The vast majority of potential universes, as people say, people who believe in the multiverse theory, which is also asinine in a number of ways, but we'll get to that possibly later in the series. People who believe, but the vast majority of other possible universes, even just the physical constants, even if you don't believe that there's anything happening at the global and agentive level, even just the constants of physics, the laws and structure of the universe, the vast majority of these do not lead to a starless and lifeless universe. So essentially how the CTMU explains creation is through this idea of telon. So as we discussed in our last video on the participatory universe, that which is utile to God is essentially his own self-identification, his own self-perception. He does this through this emergent organization and emergence. And of course, then that gives rise to agentive beings, observer participants, as John Wheeler calls them, which can then participate in the structure of the universe. And that's the telos, that's the purpose, that's what it's all striving towards, is for sentient beings to freely will to choose the good, so God can identify with that structure, and we can have this utility distributed over time. But then the universe actually configures itself according to that utility. So retroactively, again, we have the extended superposition principle. Things in the past not only affect the future, this is standard causation, but things in the future affect the past. So essentially the constants of physics are adjusted in order for the emergence of the self-utility of God, so that which is utile to God are telons, which can then attract these states and guide cosmic and biological evolution. So this is the idea of the omega point by Pierre Chaldron, who is a 20th century Jesuit theologian. The idea of the omega point is essentially that all of creation is essentially the manifestation of one will. If you think about the evolutionary process, a neo-Darwinist, which is really just a hodgepodge of Mendelian genetics and a kind of unfortunate marriage with, Darwin's idea of natural selection. It's really not a great theory, but Pierre Chaldron's interpretation of that, because natural selection is obviously a phenomenon we observe in nature, is that it's essentially the manifestation of this one will, of this telon, which is guiding cosmic and biological evolution, which is then striving towards almost a new and higher form of man. He has this quote, spirit is matter moving slow enough to be seen. And so Pierre Chaldron, it's essentially the spirit which is, permeated, this life spirit, this biospirit, which then evolves into itself. What's his face? This is Bergson's idea of creative evolution. It evolves and takes on the form of these material structures for the purpose, and then, the interplay between environment and organism, obviously this is taken for granted in Darwinism, but the interplay of the environment and organism is actually what drives forth this utility. So this is why you see the Red Queen hypothesis, is that species have to adapt to their environment, and this drives forth, and eventually you get to an omega point, which is when everyone wakes up and realizes the spiritual identity of humankind, is able to connect everything back to God, to connect to the science and philosophy and everything of all of human, and even back to biological. All of these insights are then coalesced into a new and reformed human. So this is the ultimate telos of evolution, is ultimately to move past it, to move past life, to up on the mountain, to transcend that, to transcend the cruelty and sometimes seeming absurdity of biological evolution. Obviously, there's a lot of things which seem to happen without a telos, but this is driving towards a fundamental purpose. So this is essentially what Chris Langan says that we're striving towards. He says, it's a kind of spiritual respeciation whereby we regeneratively evolve into a higher species. So evolution is, people will say, geneticists will say, evolution is over because natural selection has been halted by modern society. And this is a big problem, of course, from the perspective of biology. Chris Langan has talked about this with, we live in a very dysgenic world, but fundamentally natural selection actually hasn't evolved, because this utility is still calling us forward into the future. We're just, we just are at a very bad point in society. But Chris Langan says, the CTMU essentially has a meta-Darwinian message, which is that the universe, if you want to explain natural selection, you have to explain nature, and you have to explain selection, why it's selecting for more and more utile states. And this has to be self-utility, because there's just nothing outside of nature, outside of reality, to determine that intrinsic utility. So meta-Darwinism, the CTMU is essentially a meta-Darwinic theory. It says the universe evolves by hological self-replication. So it's a self-simulation running inside its own contents, and every point has the structure of every other point. Everything that ever is, was, or will be utile to an agentive creature, and then is able to coherently configure itself according to that global utility, which is then identified with the teleology of God. So the extended superposition principle, which allows all of these disparate events, and by events I don't mean a party, but I mean in the sense Einstein said that a particular point with an x, y, z, and t coordinate, and this is actually transformed the CTMU into a syntactic operator, but an event, and it relates these widely separated events in both space and time, and it thus allows for meaning and design by something called distributed cosmogony. So there are 4 branches of essentially the study of the birth and end of the universe. There's cosmogony, or cosmogenesis, which is the creation of the universe. There's cosmogony, which is the regular scientific discipline, which is essentially the early stages of the universe, inflation, the cosmic microwave background, the Big Bang, etc. There's eschatology, which is both in religion, it's the idea of the end times, the return of Messiah, or the beast system, etc. All these things are included in eschatology, but in science, it's also just it's essentially the universe as it begins to collapse and dissipate. It's not necessary. I'm not necessarily sure that that's going to happen, but that's what that field of study is theoretically about in cosmothanatology, which is about the end of the universe. If it just crumbles back into a big crunch, the opposite of the Big Bang. It's a reverse creation whereby everything is destroyed. But the extended superposition principle, which also ESP is obviously, you may have noticed, is an acronym for extrasensory perception, which we're also able to retrieve things which are not necessarily available to us, which wouldn't seem to be necessarily available to us using waking attention. This is the idea of paranormality. We could get to that. But the extended superposition principle allows for meaning and design by distributing cosmogony, by distributing the creation of the universe, not to any fixed point, but to every point in the universe is constantly creating itself, is constantly refining itself according to the infocognitive potential that that is interfacing with, and that's essentially the future. It's constantly creating itself at the global level and at the agentive level of humans. Humans have this telic recursion whereby, Carl Jung says, life is teleology par excellence. It's the intrinsic striving towards a goal. So, and, a series of directed aims seeking to fulfill that. So we're actually able to interact with and create reality. We discussed the observer participation thesis that, reality is essentially fine-tuned to our utility. We're actually providing the quantum information for reality to exist and evolve. The agentive level is very important to cosmic and biological evolution, of course, and so it distributes cosmogony to 3 levels. It's both at the global level. This is the God, or the global operator descriptor, and then we have the level, the agentive level of observer participants. This would include humans, any extraterrestrial life forms, etc., and the subordinate level, which is essentially particles, which are generalized to syntactic operators, which are actually transforming the syntax of the intrinsic language by which reality exists and evolves. The language which describes reality and creates the reality it's described, identified with the metalinguistic identity of the whole of the metaformal system. And so the creation event is not happening at any one point like, the scientific or even to some extent the religious theory suggests, but it's happening everywhere. It's happening everywhere at every time all at once. This is how God essentially experiences, the world at the global level, and then we are able to parse that and determine that intrinsic utility at the agentive and subordinate level. And if you think about this makes sense, because why should the universe, which is, according to relativity in the CTMU, it's actually a 4D space-time whereby time is processing space, and you can think of information as essentially space. This is, information gives rise to spatial extension, and then time is that which processes that. You can think of that as cognition, as the global mind. But reality is a 4D space-time with that conspansive dual, which explains its structure and evolution. But the universe is still a 4D space-time. It has x, y, z, t coordinates. So why would it have a beginning at any point in time any more than it would have a beginning at any one point in space? It's constantly existing and evolving in its own structure. To say time is internal to reality, reality is not a function of time. You can't say it was created at any one point, because that would be limiting the creative power and scope of reality. That's asinine. So essentially we usually think of the first cause, or there's this deistic view which was very popular in the Enlightenment, when people were kind of abandoning the traditional notion of God, but still need to explain why there's something rather than nothing, why reality isn't just uninstantiated patternless nothingness. So they introduced this idea of the first cause, and this really goes back to Aristotle. You have this primary mover, which isn't really a personal being. It kind of is removed from reality. It's just thought thinking itself, as Hegel says, and Aristotle has things very much along those lines in his Metaphysics. But you have this first cause, and what the CTMU would say, and what this distributed cosmogenesis idea would say, is that first cause is actually the structure of that which gives rise to reality, which is, of course, this generic potential, this telesis by which reality is always interfacing with and evolving, is ultimate. That is embedded at every point in space-time in the conspansive manifold. And the conspansive manifold is space-time merged with the intrinsic language by which it exists and evolves, and then you fuse those two together, and then the conspansive manifold weaves through that. So that actually is a metamathematical structure by which reality exists and evolves and describes its own structure and evolution. So at every point in that conspansive manifold, you not only have the first cause, but you also have a fine-tuning. This is another thing that people need to figure out. If we don't have God, then why is there all this organization and self-organization and self-emergence? It doesn't make sense, because without as Aristotle said, primary, pattern-generating prime mover, which has a telos for reality, which is trying to identify itself, as Plato, his idea is the nous and the world soul, or the light by which the one sees itself. The one is obviously another term for God. So the one sees itself and then identifies itself with the structure which teleologically evolves. But this is all the structure is coming from, as Wolfgang Smith says, the aveternal plane, and then descending down into creation. And so if you don't have this, intrinsic teleology, this intrinsic end and purpose of what reality is striving towards, then the question, of course, arises is why the human body, let's say, has 1,000 things that need to be fine-tuned. Unless you have this telon, which is guiding biological evolution, it doesn't make sense that these things could coalesce. I don't have any specific examples. Just think about the eye. Think about all the things which had to go right. This can't be explained as an accident of random mutation. Perhaps you could say it is a consequence of mutation, but this is guided by that telon and that intrinsic teleology. So that fine-tuning and that first cause actually turn out to be the same, because the purpose of reality, the reason why there is a universe, people will say, oh, there could be a universe where no humans ever evolved. That's simply not true, or at least where no life and consciousness has ever evolved. That's not possible, because the purpose of reality is essentially that self-identification that can't be done without causation at the agentive level, which is identified with, intelligence and, let's say, which is identified with intelligence. It's identified with life. It's identified with consciousness. So at that level, the self-theorization which happens and reality is able to become aware of itself through this agentive level of observer participation, the that is the same as the first cause, because that is the intrinsic asymmetry in, let's say, the unbound telesis, that which precedes creation. There's an intrinsic asymmetry which compels it forward to evolve into something intelligible and meaningful, because I talked to Tyler Goldstein yesterday. He said, the meaning of creation is the creation of meaning. It's trying to create meaning for itself, and it does this through this fine-tuning to fine-tune a universe which is most utile to the things which derive utility from it. So, people will get confused. We say, this is the best of all possible worlds, and they'll say, oh, well, look at all this evil and suffering and these children, getting bone cancer. Obviously, this can't be the case, but that's simply not true, because it's fine-tuned so that when we get to that omega point, as Pierre Chaldron says, we can make this the best of all possible worlds for us and for everyone living in it. But this has to happen at the agentive level. This can't be the global level, or else it's not providing any real information. There's no utility to God if everything is predetermined. The existence of good implies the existence of evil, and vice versa. And so, obviously, we can get rid of evil, but we can't get rid of the choice of evil, because that would be denying the good, and the good is, the ultimate form which gives rise to all existence. This is Plato's idea that God is the author of the good, and obviously this has a number of implications which we'll get into later, but the fine-tuning in the first cause, the creation and the purpose, can't be set apart in the final analysis. They're one quanta of meaning creation, or creation meaning. And so there's this idea from Maimonides, the first line of Genesis, which we'll get into in detail later, is Bereshit bara, or give me a moment to remember. Bereshit bara Elohim, God created Hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so what he says is this term Bereshit, this is usually translated as in the beginning, but you can actually take it as two words. You can take the Be and the Reshit apart, and you get, from the intelligences, God created the heavens and the earth. So God, and the intelligences is this idea of the Aristotelian spheres, the angels, which guide cosmic and biological evolution. Sounds like something we just talked about. This is telon. So God is setting up these telons which provide intrinsic utility, and set up the world in which the interaction between organism and environment can be the most utile. This is the fundamental framework you need to justify Darwinism. I don't think Darwinism is completely wrong. I'm not a young Earth creationist, and in fact, to make it work, you need to move beyond science and get to this metaphysical level of this telon, of this intrinsic utility of reality. And so God creates these telons for teleological evolution, to evolve towards a certain telos, towards a certain intrinsic end and purpose. And so and as we said earlier, natural selection needs, this idea of nature and selection, and this can only happen through this cross-temporal feedback, whereby reality can determine its own structure and evolution. So, people will say, everything can, like, let's say Richard Dawkins is someone who's very big into the gene-centered and ateleological view of evolution, but why does the Earth exist? Why are there single cellular organisms, even if you accept that these can, of their own volition, which is obviously asinine, but let's accept it for the moment that single-celled organisms can evolve into human beings and tigers and dogs and cats and all this rich diversity, these quintillions of creatures. Obviously, there's no impetus for the reproduction and evolution of this in an atheist cosmology, but let's ignore that for the moment. How do the laws of physics in the universe arise, which actually creates that environment, create those organisms? And, I think if you have an answer to that, I'd be happy to hear that, but I just don't see a model for that, and I don't see the possibility for a model for that, and I've actually thought about that. So there's this idea of perception as utility, because the self-perception is the intrinsic utility of reality, and this distributes into the conscious awareness of agentive observed participants, of human beings, that our perception is, our intrinsic utility is perception. This is Coronius Focus, a great channel which you should check out. He talks about this, that, and he's actually talked about the CTMU as well, that it's perception which is driving forward evolution. And perception is obviously, perception is not just seeing objective things. This is a part of perception, but perception is actually, if you look into the cognitive structure of it, you're actually ranking things by utility. You don't see something, you can say, what relates a stump and a chair made of metal and a chair made of wood and a chair that's 15 feet tall and 5 feet tall, and what relates all these things? And someone like Plato would say that it's the word chair, this idea, this eternal form, which gives existence to all those chairs. And that's in part correct, but that is actually a metaphysical pattern determined by the utility of chair. This is of chairs. We perceive chairs not as, objective quality of it's this many feet tall. We can measure that, but what we actually perceive them is something that we can sit on. It's absolute. So our perception is us, and our cognition is us modeling objective reality for the purpose of our own utility. And so this self-perception then drives evolution. This is the Red Queen hypothesis that, that you're going out and confronting the universe and modeling objective reality. If you do this right, you will survive, and you will pass on your genes, and reality will continue evolving. This is the best version of the, let's say, Darwinist perspective. And so there's this idea of unisection, which is that anything which is realized in a medium is a property of the medium itself. So you have to accept that if there is design, intelligence, etc. in the universe, so you see this with human beings, you see this, we've talked about earlier, the self-organization and self-emergence of galaxies, star systems, etc., that these seem to be also related to intelligence, that there has to be a fundamental mechanism for intelligence and design embedded in the very creation of the universe at every point, whereby at every syntactic operator, every point in the conspansive manifold has to have this structure, has to have a generic form of intelligence and cognition and perception, and is able to coherently self-model and become a part of that self-model at the global and agentive level. This is Leibniz's monads, that they're windowless souls, essentially. People think of particles as just physical things. There's not even a good definition of that. What does it mean to just be a physical thing? The monads, this is Leibniz's idea, is they're windowless souls, essentially, which reflect the structure of the universe as a whole, and are thus able to coherently self-model, and we're able to pass through them, and they can re-quantize. And this is Stephen Wolfram's idea that when we're moving, we're actually passing into a different set of atoms. And this doesn't make sense from a physical perspective, but you can, if you have this metaphysical / conspansive dual of this monadology, or you can call it syntactic operators in the CTMU, it's all the same concept. It reduces everything to telesis. So this is this monic substrate from which everything emerges, which relates, everything in reality. Telesis, unbound telesis is essentially pure infocognitive potential, and then telesis is the specific realization of that potential in the universe. So, unbound telesis is the metaverse. It's everything that possibly could be according to a syntax, the syntactic metaverse. And then the universe is telesis, that which has actually been realized, and that which is instantiated according to the utility driving forward that which is extracting order out of the unbound telesis. And then you can extend telesis, so you can reduce everything in reality to telesis, and then you can extend telesis to include all of reality. So reality is a single quanta which is existing and evolving in its own structure. This is John Wheeler's idea of the one electron universe, is that reality, just like an electron is giving lattice to the atom, this actually is essentially the fundamental particle in my view. I might actually publish a paper on that, probably not soon, but maybe in a year or two, because I have a lot of interesting ideas along those lines. But he has this idea of the one electron universe, and what this essentially means is that he talked with Richard Feynman. He said, why do all these electrons have the same weight? And Richard Feynman's like, I don't know. And John Wheeler says, because they're all part of the same electron. They're all part of the same monic identity, which distributes over all of these as a universal distributed form and creates certain constants like the size of the electron, Planck's constant. There's no reason why any of these things should exist, why different parts of reality should be intelligible to each other outside of this monic identity. He calls this the one electron universe because reality is constantly inter-expanding and re-quantizing in its own structure in order to exist and evolve. And there are these telons that are, driving forward cosmic and biological evolution, that they're the intrinsic ends of this one electron or of this monic identity. And through this participatory anthropic principle, as we said, it's evolving according to the utility of the agentive things that it creates, the human beings, observer participants. And so reality is set up, the universe is set up in order to provide the most possible utility to us and to creatures like us. There are 3 levels of telic recursion. There's global, agentive, and subordinate, as we've been over. And global is God, agentive is human and human-like observer participants, and subordinate is essentially at the level of particles or physical objects. So telesis is like a pixel. It can display anything based on the supersubjective utility determined by the interplay of sentient organisms in reality. There's this idea Stephen Wolfram has of the hypergraph, and the hypergraph essentially it's a set of atoms. This can be any number. There could be a universal hypergraph. There could be a hypergraph that describes how this notebook is held together. But anyway, it's a hypergraph, and it relates different atoms and allows them to evolve according to the same metacomputational rules for its self-organization, self-emergence, in order for it to remain, coherent, to be a single object. And so, and as we discussed, objectivity is related to the perception of utility by subjects, by observer participants, and so anything which can be described as objective. This is why Tyler Goldstein, who I discussed with yesterday, this is why he calls everything super subjective, because its utility and its existence and its emergence and its structure and evolution is always determined by the interplay of, even though it might seem objective and concrete and physical, that objectivity and concreteness and physicality is determined by the interplay of utility of sentient observer participants. And so hypergraphs, they're the expansive dual of that, which actually explains its structure and evolution. I actually think Stephen Wolfram's model falls a bit short. I'm not sure, but I think I've discussed this on the channel. It allows for specified complexity, so this is something like biological life, which is specific and it's complex. It couldn't have been realized. This is proven by William Dembski, that something as complex and specific as biological life could not have been realized by any combination of random or deterministic processes. There has to be a teleology. There has to be something driving this forward. So it can allows for this specified complexity and self-organization, because telesis is essentially energy plus information plus metaphysics. So it's energy in the sense that this is proven by Einstein, that energy is the monic substrate of the universe. But Chris Langen says, hey, wait up, not so fast, because there's actually something that has to organize that energy, and that's information. Energy is organized according to information. And then the metaphysics is that which holds it all together. Beyond the physical level, it's how does information interact with energy, and this has to happen at a level beyond both information and energy. And this is the telic level. This is the level of telesis. This is the level of metaphysics. And so the information is provided by the syntactic operators. Every point at the subordinate level in the conspansive manifold is, it has the structure of the entire universe as a self-processing, self-configuring language, and thus is able to interface with and transform and evolve with that syntax. So the whole of that, as we discussed, all of the structure, all of the evolution, all of the creation of everything in the universe is embedded at every point, every syntactic operator, and that's how reality is able to organize itself. So this is an extension of the hypergraph idea. And so a syntactic operator is just like, I believe this is Alan Watts said this, that just as a wave is a function of what the whole ocean is doing. You are a function of what the whole universe is doing. And this can be, even this is true, but at the agentive level, because we're, human beings, and we're also a component of the universe, and we have that utility. But this is also true at the subordinate level. Syntactic operator is a function of what the whole universe is doing, just as a wave is a function of what the whole ocean is doing. There's this hology, the entire structure of that self-processing, self-configuring language, the language by which reality exists and evolves, that intrinsic language which creates the reality it describes, is embedded at every point. So universe, the meta-linguistic meta-object is composed of things which share its structure. It can't be any other way, and that's both linguistic and objective. You can't deny either part of that reality. So from hology, the idea that reality can actually intelligibly exist and evolve in its own structure, can relate disparate points, the extended superposition. From hology, from disorder emerges this supersubjective order, which is this participatory anthropic interplay of utility, and which is related to the utility of all observer participants over all of time, including into the future, what will continue to set up the best of all possible worlds going forward, such that reality can achieve this self-identification, can achieve this intrinsic end. And so that's how the order emerges from this primordial chaos, which we'll get into earlier, which is a primary feature in both mythology and even to an extent in our current scientific models. We have this idea of quantum foam and these quantum fluctuations which precede the universe, and this actually is very compatible with the CTMU for reasons we'll get into later. So this is the best of all possible universes, because it's designed according to that intrinsic utility. So you can say, as Plato said, God is the author of the good only. Augustine had this idea that, if God is only the author of the good, then how does evil rise? And this is actually turning away from God. So this is when you fail to align your own utility, because obviously biological evolution often gives us incentives to do things which are against the global utility of reality. So I can get ahead biologically by raping and murdering and doing all these evil and terrible things, but that is immoral, because I'm failing to align myself with the intrinsic end and purpose of reality. Because I'm within reality, that's my intrinsic end and purpose too. And so when I'm denying that, I'm denying my very identity. I'm essentially reducing myself to the most base and primal instincts. And so this is Augustine's idea that evil is a turning away from God, and this is super, super important, and I'll probably do a full video on that, because and Augustine's idea of the city of God and the new Jerusalem and the dualism between these two, which allows this respeciation, as Chris Langan talks about through Jesus. This is a very, very Augustinian idea, I think. But we'll get into that in a different video. So as we discussed, information is space, cognition is time, and so we have to, if we're thinking about cosmogenesis, we have to think about the genesis and evolution of the universe through infocognition, through this generic quanta, which is basically the fundamental substrate of reality, is space-time, is infocognition. So we have to explain space-time through information transduction, through what meaning is created through creation. I think we've done this quite well. So telesis is this primordial infocognitive potential from which anything can emerge, and then so creation is you need a structure to sort through that infinite information there in order for it to be utile to you. If you have a spreadsheet with infinite entries, it's not doing anything. So perception does this at the global and agentive level. There's this limerick from Berkeley. It's I find it odd that this tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad, because things only exist, according to Berkeley, according to our perception of them. To be is to be perceived. And he says, so what happens when you leave, when nothing's looking at it? And he says, the tree continues to be since it's observed by yours faithfully God, that God is this global perception which merges all of this agentive utility across time and creates the emergence of the world. But then perception is essentially a hierarchy. It's a ranking. So we're ranking things by the utility to us, by the utility to reality for us to exist and evolve in. And so we're sorting through this potential. This is how reality determines what is most utile to it. And so the telos of perception is essentially, and by extension of human existence, because human existence is essentially a generalization of perception, because what we're doing is modeling reality, and the fundamental quanta of that is perception and cognition. So the telos is for the order that is good to be extracted out from that infocognitive potential, from that tapestry of infinite expansive potentiality through telic recursion, which means I can actually the universe retroactively determines its own structure it calls on itself according to an intrinsic end or purpose in order to evolve towards an end. It's distributing programming, not in the computational sense, but in the metaphysical and linguistic sense. It's telling itself how to evolve and to refine itself from this primordial state, this chaos, and then order emerges from that. The order that is good is extracted out through telic recursion, and that's not a rearranging. This isn't the Platonic idea that God is just rearranging pre-existing matter. No, that telic recursion, that intrinsic utility creates space, it creates time, it creates cognition, it creates information, it creates syntax, it creates state transition, it creates everything. So God can identify with that. So God can identify with something separate from himself in order to reinforce, define, and extend his essence according to that energy, that telesis which emanates from God. That generic form of himself is what he creates from. It's not nothing. There's this idea of creatio ex nihilo. This is a contradiction. Ex nihilo nihil fit. But if God has nothing external, out of nothing comes nothing. But if God has nothing external to himself by which to create, he has to create from a generic form of his own potential and then extract out creation from that. So it's a self-restriction of God in order to allow for a physical universe as the world. So it's a turning away from God's essence and energy in order to have something utile to God. And so the telon of life and consciousness which is driving this forward, and this is one of the most general telons, because this is what reality is trying to do. It's trying to become conscious of itself. It's trying to become alive, in a sense, to become self-aware, mediates order and chaos, or infinity and cardinality. It mediates between these two and emerges these structures. Materiality and spirituality, they each organizes the other. The spiritual becomes material and the material becomes spiritual. It's informed by this higher spiritual meaning, and the spiritual meaning rearranges matter. And so it parses the universe. This is Stephen Wolfram's idea of what consciousness is actually doing. It's making reality intelligible to itself, because you can't just, if you're perceiving everything, then you're perceiving nothing. So you're perceiving, so reality is then perceiving itself from a very limited perspective, and this is what it's driving forward to do. There's Bernardo Kastrup has this idea of this consciousness-only ontology, because this is the fundamental quantum of the universe is this subjective experience, essentially. Everything else emerges from that and the interplay of that, and this universal mind which you could identify with God through subordinate and global telic recursion. So humans then, according to Chris Langan, are not just chemical scum which are supervening on brute physical processes, but we're actually integral to the structure and evolution of reality. We're providing this agentive level information for reality. So in the secondary tellers create the universe because it is fine-tuned to their utility. So we're providing the information for reality to continue to exist and evolve, and to have existed and evolved seemingly paradoxically, we're providing the information for reality to have existed and evolved prior to our instantiation, because it's obviously we're doing this in the non-terminal sense, that is, distributing programming in order to create a utile environment for us to exist in, and we channel and actualize generalized utility within it. This is our purpose, is that self-identification. And so the primary stage of telic recursion maximizes generalized utility on an ad hoc basis as local tellers freely and independently maximize their local utility function. So when that local utility function lines up with the global utility function, with God's utility, that is essentially when that means a human being is doing something, or an observer participant is doing something well, because he didn't have to do that. Again, I can rape and murder and do all these terrible things. I could be like Genghis Khan or Joseph Stalin, and that was probably advantageous to them, but it's not. But then you're removing yourself from existence. You're denying your very fundamental identity. God is your own highest level of being, and where you're denying that, you're in a sense denying yourself. And this is not smart. So humans can choose less than the best of all possible worlds, where God can't. So if God is just continuously creating the best of all possible worlds, and for him that might be just existing in his own essence and basking in the glory and light of the Godhead and the light by which the one sees itself in this closed loop, this isn't really meaningful, because there's nothing happening there. So humans, by being able to choose less than the best of all possible worlds, this means God can identify with something separate from himself and define, reinforce, and extend his structure through human beings and observer participants who have chosen freely to be moral, essentially. And so teleology is the alignment of the individual's will with God's will to further the creation of meaning in the universe. So this could be through, human civilization has been the greatest attempt I know of. You could say maybe there is an extraterrestrial civilization distantly in the past that I don't know. I don't have any insight into this. But as far as I know, human civilization is the best way that this has happened, at least in this universe. So contributing to that, not contributing to the decline of civilization, doing violent crime, being, just serving your own utility, trying to get as rich as possible, without care for the actual consequences of that. That would be bad. That would be going against the intrinsic teleology of reality. So you want to further human civilization, the opportunity for people in the future to not go extinct and to not have bad lives, so that they can cooperate with this telos. And you also want to do pure and blessed things just for their own sakes, because this is what would God do? And that is actually what your intrinsic purpose is, to figure out what God would do and then to do that, so God can identify with that structure. So God gains information by finding good tellers to define, reinforce, and extend his structure, and find out what works for self-identification, what can I identify with for the furtherance of my intrinsic utility, of the intrinsic language by which I exist and evolve. So reality is a hologic it's a self-simulation. We've been over this, but it's a hologic self-simulative scratch pad to compare the utility of possible configurations of the universe and possible syntaxes for sentient agents. So this is David Hume's idea in Dialogue on Natural Religion, that that the universe is constantly figuring out how to configure itself better. And so it's comparing the utility of possible configurations in the metaverse, because the metaverse, the syntactic metaverse, is any possible instantiation within given rules and structure. Whereas, we want to see what is the best of all possible worlds, and this is what God is continuously creating on an ad hoc basis according to the secondary utility of his tellers. So telons then, which are based on that utility, coordinate events / timelines to bring about their emergence retroactively, because this is what is valuable. The telon for example, the telon of the human singularity, which is driving, this this global worldwide event whereby, human civilization will, through an understanding of its identity, will, resist a corporate oligarchy, financial, technological elites, everything being gravitated into a kind of, 1 second, I'm switching microphones. So this human singularity, which is resisting that black hole of all wealth and human utility being gravitated to the pockets of the global elite, and thereby having this centralized hive-like structure which essentially deprives reality of its intrinsic meaning and purpose. That which is resisting it by providing an intrinsic understanding of humanity's identity and our role and purpose in the universe, as I'm trying to do right now, and rationally justifying why what is going on is bad. Because an atheist could say, oh well, this is bad, and you can say, well, why? Why do we deserve to live? Why do we deserve to continue to create purity and blessedness? Why is this a good thing? You couldn't justify this aside from the utility of God. So there's this tell-on of the human singularity, because this is potentially happening in the future. So this potential is constantly calling us, and this is reinforced by the utility of people who are committing their lives to actually furthering this vision. And this is why this is so important. This is calling this forward into the future. It's coordinating events and timelines to bring about the emergence, but there's also an equal and opposite, and possibly even a greater and opposite force on the side of the tech singularity, on the side of all wealth and power being centralized in the hands of very, very few people. And essentially that's the end, even if there continue to be human beings. That this if this egregore, this tell-on, gets what it wants, it's game over. There's nothing left. And so that's why we need to fight like hell, is because there are opposite forces. This is Augustine's idea that everything can be divided into, it's a spiritual warfare of good versus evil. And so that's why we need to fight like hell, is because we need to be a part of one tell-on and not a part of the other, because one is defining, reinforcing, extending God's structure, and one is negating and blaspheming and canceling God's structure. And so I think it's very clear which is which. So every object is in every other object by homology. Its extended structure is embedded in every point in the universe. So the universe relates to everything. So each point in the conspansive manifold relates to every other point, relates to every other object, and relates to the whole. So reality is thusly self-simulation running inside its own contents to search for the good order. It's a self-simulated scratch pad, as we said, trying out all these different possible configurations to see what works for this self-identification. So reality is this generative grammar, this intrinsic language by which reality exists and evolves according to this generative grammar called mu, which is also multiplex unity, which is that universal distributed form, which relates the many places in reality, which creates the reality it describes as a self-processing, self-configuring language, and subsists as syntax/universal distributed form, which relates everything to one another and the whole, allowing for extended superposition. So mu is a generative/transformational grammar with cellular automata with these local hypergraphs, which determine the self-organization and self-emergence of the universe. Operating on the global syntax, on that generative grammar, is embedded within every point, which can then operate and transform the global structure of the self-processing, self-configuring language, which is identified with reality as a whole. And so this is how causation is able to occur at the agentive and subordinate levels. So the words produced by mu grammar are not strings of symbol, but spatiotemporal relationships, or hypergraphs, as Wolfram would call them, in the objective universe, which can read and write to each other's state using extended superposition. Of course, this requires that there be that conspansive dual. So the conspansive manifold is constantly, it's language talking to itself about itself for its own purposes. So it's communicating with itself in order to determine how to exist and evolve in a way that is most utile to it. So the word, the logos, the metalinguistic identity of reality, this is unisects with heaven and earth. So let's draw this out. So we have a syndiphionic I don't have it yet. We have a syndiphionic diagram. So in Genesis 1, you have heaven and you have earth. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering above the water. So Genesis 1. But then, Genesis 1:1. But you have, in John 1:1, in the New Testament, you have a different creation story. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among men. And he was the light which lighteth every man, which cometh into the world. So you have heaven and earth, and you have the Logos. And what this implies is, because they differ from one another in a structure-preserving sense, which is they are both identified with reality, there has to be a more general medium identified with reality itself, which is Logos, heaven, earth, which is the beginning. Because both of these are in the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and in the beginning was the Logos, was the Word, and the Logos was God, and the Logos was with God, and the Word was God. So the beginning is identified with this syntactic unisect of heaven, earth, and the Logos. And thusly, the Word, the Logos, the metalinguistic identity of reality, unisects with heaven and earth to create a terminal non-terminal domain, or a material/spiritual world. So this is a self-dual quanta. It's both terminal and non-terminal. It's both spiritual and material, bound together by an intrinsic language as an interactive self-stimulation by which it can explore semantic potential. And so this is the meaning of the God equation in the metaformal system. This is, I'll draw this out. It's M equals L int equals LS LO. So this is M equals L int equals LS LO, and LS and LO are interchangeable because so M is the metalinguistic identity of reality. It's the metaformal system. It's the intrinsic, which is then identified, the totality, the inception of all of existence, the everything that can and does exist is within that identity. And then that exists and evolves according to an intrinsic language that's identified with the structure of that whole. So reality is a metalinguistic meta-object. It's both an object and a language. And it passes through two different phases, both a subjective language, which describes all the subjective things happening in reality, and it's an objective language, which describes the material and concrete things happening in reality. So the identity of reality is an intrinsic language which couples the subjective and objective aspects of the universe, which could colorfully be rendered as, of course, heaven and earth, if you so choose. Subjective being heaven, the spiritual world, and the material or objective being earth. And so this is coupled and tied together and brought into unison by the metalinguistic identity of reality, which is embedded in every single point. And so, interestingly, many of the primitive, creation myths from early societies follow the same structure as the CTMU. That an ordering good emerges from a primordial chaos that seems to be a consistent narrative across societal myths. So in Sumerian mythology, it says, when heaven below and earth above, when heaven above and earth below had not been formed, there was the interplay between Apsu and Tiamat, which are, one is a kind of watery abyss. This is identified in Genesis with the waters that the Spirit of God is floating over. But it's Apsu and Tiamat, which could respectively be considered LS and LO because they're masculine and feminine deities, from which the pantheon of 600 deities emerged. And actually, the idea of gods is actually, in primitive societies, is not really like our conception, is more like our conception of telons, of these things guiding cosmic and biological evolutions, and thereby kind of take on intelligence and personality of their own. This would be a very charitable interpretation. They're more like that than the Abrahamic gods. So this actually is essentially a correct description of reality when interpreted in that sense. In Egypt, the beginning is a spirit still formless that bore within itself the sum of all existence. This is unbound telesis, pure potentiality, everything that is, was, and will be, everything that could be, the sum of all existence, and that's a god named Atum, which means to be complete, it signifies the intrinsic asymmetry in the unbound telesis, or the pre-bound telesis, from which drives forth existence. From the order that is good is extracted out of that primary potential. So if they could intuit such profound knowledge, are arguably better than even today's top academic scientists. They'll talk to you about quantum fluctuations, and there's some of that because it's kind of this primordial realm, but they're not really getting the essence of it. They're, as Wolfgang Smith, they actually, some academic scientists know less than 5-year-olds because they can't say, that chair, they will say that chair is blank feet tall and has all these objective qualities, but they can't say it's hard or it has a certain color. They can say it has a certain wavelength, but they deny the actual experience of it as we exist in reality. And so Atum then created all the gods and goddesses, every living creature, and the respective heavenly and earthly environment. So this is the sum of all existence, is also the telon, which calls the present into the future. This is telic recursion, which then allows for specified complexity and self-organization. So it makes you wonder what else these ancient civilizations knew, because they clearly had a very, very profound and deep understanding of things which we seem to have forgotten. Hindu scripture says, all was darkness without form, beyond reason and perception, as if wholly asleep. Then the self-existent Lord became manifest, making all discernible within his power, unfolding the universe in the form of its elements, and scattering the shades of its elements, and scattering the shades of darkness, actualizing the primordial infocognitive potential. And yet, despite all this, the most vicious attacks, obviously, by scientism are not against the Sumer and Egypt, but against the Judaic-Christian creation story, respectively, as we said in Genesis 1 and John 1. We're going to quickly examine Genesis 1 and then wrap the video up, because this is now over an hour, which I did not intend, but that's fine. The final passage of Genesis 1 the first passage of Genesis 1 says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, which is usually rendered as in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But actually, the be in Bereshit is actually indefinite in the Hebrew verb form. So it actually directly translates, and this is reflected in some of the Hebrew translations, is that when God began to create. So Genesis 1 would then read when God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and there was the primordial waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and God says, let there be light, let there be this ordering potential, and there was light, because light is This is news. This is mine. This is the light by which the one sees itself. And so, sorry, where was I? This is the light by which the one sees itself. So when God began to create, the earth was formless and void. It's the extraction of an order from formlessness and void, which are tohu and bohu, which are actually not usually considered to be, concepts that it's just formless and void. The scripture rarely repeats itself with like adjectives that mean the same thing. They're actually primordial ingredients. They're unbound telesis. They're this primordial chaos from which order arises. The good order is extracted from that by God's speech. And so Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Bara does not refer to creation ex nihilo, but instead the rearrangement of pre-existing materials. This generic potential God, which is, in the early universe you have, there's nothing really important going on. There's no meaning being created. It's just basically the interplay of particles, which is obviously striving towards, through this telic recursion, through what's calling the present and the future, it's striving towards self-organization, self-emergence, according to the intrinsic utility of tellers going into the future. But so that's what's happening. That's the bara is God determining these telons, determining that teleological evolutions. So again, we said Bereshit lacks a definite article. It's God transforming creation from a disordered state into an ordered state by extended superposition and the principle of economy, which means it's trying to deviate from its generalized utility the least that it possibly can, and teleologic evolution towards an intrinsic goal and purpose. So this is, Chris Langan has a quote which I can't put it up because I didn't set that up, but I'll read it to close out the video. It's Chris Langan. Bear with me. Chris Langan on religious metaphor. Let's ponder the universe for a moment while this is loading. Just think about the nature of it. Close your eyes. Begin to feel it. Feel it in your bones. Feel it in your eyes. Begin to perceive the light of the one. And then keep your eyes closed for maybe a minute or two longer. This is super fucking annoying. Okay, anyhow, so I know basically the quote. So he says that, the CTMU essentially said that there's a level on which science and religious metaphor are mutually compatible. God is using this evolution as a tool in his creation. So there's no actual real difference between the Big Bang and the creation event, or because this is essentially the singularity is in the Big Bang is identified as a physical singularity, where it actually should be identified with the closed syntax of the self-processing, self-configuring language, this primordial potential from which it logically emerged, and from which even space and time itself emerge. So the Big Bang is then brought into coincidence with creation, and the creation of life is also brought into coincidence with natural selection. So the CTMU is a meta-language by which both science and religion can be interpreted, and on which science and religious metaphor are mutually compatible, and we can have a full and complete understanding of creation, its meaning, and the intrinsic purpose and ends of our lives without falling into mechanistic materialism. So thank you. Let the light shine forth from the darkness, and the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. Like and subscribe. Peace.